Well, good afternoon, National Museum of American History and Smithsonian colleagues. Well, good afternoon, National Museum of American History and Smithsonian colleagues, and welcome to the Smithsonian Staff Learning Series hosted by the National Museum of American History. The goal of the series is to explore the trends, topics, and research relating to the public so that we may better understand our current and our future audiences. My name is Adam Razan, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's talk, in which we are joined by Jaime M. Grant, the research director of the National LGBTQ+ Women's Community Survey, who will share insights that no one has seen before on the survey and the data collected from 8,000 plus respondents. In addition to serving as the research director for the National LGBTQ+ Women's Community Survey, she was the principal investigator for the National Transgender Discrimination Survey and has been active in anti-racist, feminist, and queer-led liberation work for the past 30 years. For the past 5 years, she has been training globally on grassroots research methods and sexual liberation projects and processes with queer and trans activists from Beijing to Cape Town, Kenya to Kolkata, and Havana to Hong Kong. Jaime is the former director of the Policy Institute of the National LGBTQ Task Force and past executive director of the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership at Kalamazoo College. Please note that this discussion is being recorded with closed captioning, and I will be helping our speaker by moderating the chat. So please add your questions there. One thing to note that I'll be running the slides for Jaime, so I won't be able to see your chats and comments until we go to the Q&A section, but please do add your comments. And last but not least, I'd love to hear from you. So please take a moment today or tomorrow and share your thoughts on the series, today's talk, past speakers, and your ideas for the future. And thank you. And Jaime, with that, let's welcome you to the stage, and the floor is yours. And I will get going with sharing your PowerPoint. Sorry, everybody.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. And I was just saying that the Smithsonian means so much to me, and the Museum of American History means so much to me. And I remember in the 90s, I moved here in 1990 at the height of the AIDS crisis to do LGBT work. And I went to From Parlor to Politics, which was just such an incredible exhibit of women's activism in the US. And all of the work, all the lesbians who were in that exhibit were invisible. And it was just absolutely crushing to me. And I remember we were doing so much direct action then, I really wanted to come and do something. But all of that to say is the Smithsonian plays such an important, crucial role in communicating our histories. And it's so meaningful. It is the people's museum. And, you know, I'm raising my kids here. The museums have been kind of their living room and their lab their whole lives. And so I'm just thrilled to have everybody here to talk about this, because this project is really near and dear to my heart. And as Adam said, we were supposed to already be out with the book. And as these things go, the report won't come out until the 26th of June. So you're getting embargoed data. They're the first people who are going to see any of our findings. So don't tell anybody until the 26th of June, and then you can talk all you want. So this is the National LGBTQ Women's Survey. We can go to the next slide. I co-founded this project with Urvashi Vad in 2019. Urvashi passed a year ago, and was just an absolutely critical person in my life for 33 years, 35 years, as an activist, a mentor, a thinker, and a radical. And in 2018, we just started talking about that. We just felt like the movement was losing some threads about the needs of LGBTQ women across the board, and that anti-trans stuff was really impeding our efforts to really look at the full breadth of LGBTQ women's experiences. So we decided to create this project. Next slide. And there's Irv doing what she does best, which was disrupt and recreate. She's that's a famous AIDS action she did against George Bush 1 who was doing nothing on AIDS at the time, and she got dragged out of there and then could never go back to the White House to any of our fun celebratory things afterwards. And her spirit is so in this project, and I feel super honored to pull that thread through. So you can go to the next. So who was this study for and about? Because we wanted academics to be able to do research long and hard, we went with over 18, which is a little easier to do than having young people in the study. We were interested in a domestic study because we didn't have a ton of money. We had almost nothing really, and no major home at a national organization. We were doing it on our own with a group of activists from around the country. So we went with lives in the US. We wanted anyone who has or does identify as a woman because we were interested in the ways that misogyny plays out wherever we find ourselves on the path as women. And we wanted to look at people who centered their lives on women, emotionally, socially, sexually, familially. So this included lesbian, bi, queer, non-binary, and trans people who have identified or do identify as women and want to report on their experiences of partnering with women. And in that way, we were really challenging the whole category of LGBT women for other researchers and for ourselves in the community as we advocate for LGBTQ women's lives. Next slide. And please write all your comments and thoughts, and I'm dying to hear what people are thinking. So why this study and why now? I mean, Irv and I were really interested in the flows of violence and discrimination impacting LGBT women. What are our risks and resiliencies? And how are they compounded? Because whatever risks and resiliencies we have, we then partner with LGBT women, and we have, a multiplicity of factors going on. We knew there was no national comprehensive data on LGBT women, which just really pissed us off. There are very few federal surveys that collect data on LGBT people as a whole, few state surveys. Everybody collects differently. It's very hard to sort of, look at it across the board. And we knew, because I had been a principal investigator on the 2011 National Trans Study, that comprehensive data across multiple domains really helps you get a 360 look at people's lives and what kind of the gauntlet of discrimination is, right? The full picture of it. And that doing national and comprehensive studies has sort of a multiplier effect. It did in the case of trans folks, and we thought LGBTQ women could also do the same. So we wanted to bust out of those silos and fully describe ourselves, because we really felt like both the women's movement and the LGBTQ movement couldn't really see us and see what our needs are. So next. So this is book one coming out. There's going to be 3 books because, man, we asked 170 questions. We have data for decades, basically. So the book that's coming out on June 6, describes our methods. There's a foreword by Bianca Wilson at the Williams Institute on what have we done so far? What's the sort of field look like, and why this study, why now? Bianca's on our advisory committee, has been absolutely critical to the process. We have a portrait of the sample. We did engage with 8,000 people, but our N ultimately for this is 5,000 because only 5,000 answered all 170. And in this first look at the data, we wanted to sort of have as comprehensive a look of everybody who was able to finish and make comparisons. We're looking at gender and sexuality across the lifespan, which I think is one of the most interesting pieces of the instrument and results. Experiences in education, disability, intimate partner violence, religious upbringing and religious life, our sexual practices and joy, and our policy priorities. And that's just book one. Next slide. Book two is coming out in September, and it's hard for me to read this. Family of origin, family formation and relationships, children and parenting. And I have to say those chapters are going to be explosive, so I'm taking my time with them. Not even going to give you a hint about what's going on in our families. Health care, access and outcomes, housing, sociality and social life, and experiences of racism within LGBTQ women's communities. We asked a lot of questions about people's experiences of race and racism in the community so that we can better build our community. And then book 3 in December, employment, policing and incarceration, so let's say social and economic security, political life and volunteerism, and aging. So there's a ton of data here. Next. So sexuality, I'm gonna have to. So Yes, this is a heavily lesbian identified sample. Since we said the study was for LGBTQ women who have or do identify women and center their lives on women, it's clear that bi, pan, queer women who may partner with women some of the time, but don't necessarily, that's not a central thing for their lives. They opted out, right? So our call for respondents has created definitely not what you get in a random sample. We have many more. This is a heavily lesbian identified sample. So next slide. And we offered people a lot of possible detail in identifying themselves. This is one of the more interesting pieces of the survey instrument. We said, sexuality is complex. Do you want to tell us more? And then our sample could choose from these identifiers. Next slide. 41% of our respondents said their sexuality was complex. And then that is a descending order look at how they identified. And again, we're not saying this is how all lesbians would identify, but for this highly lesbian identified sample, this is how they think about themselves. And one of the things that I think is really important for in this sort of turfy moment that is so, trying to divide us, everybody across sexualities and genders, many people found their sexuality and their genders complex, not just the trans-identified people. So that is an incredible story about our lesbian sexuality across the lifespan. If you go to the next. And then genders. This is a heavily femme sample. Again, not what you get in a random sampling. So I think this is probably going to be the biggest lesbian femme identified sample that we have, period. And that is just going to give us a lot of interesting things to, again, sort of push back on about what people think of as basically cisgender lesbian femme experience, how we live our lives, everything from who we have sex with to who we partner with to how we form our families to a million experiences. So, and, also a very reason, those are high numbers to look at around masculine, non-binary, gender fluid, and otherwise gendered people as well. So we've got a lot of great things we can look at for commonalities and differences. And next. So we had a very complex gender instrument. You could choose from any of these amazing genders. When we said, gender is complex, would you like to provide us with more detail? We provided this list of possibilities and people identified all over the place, and yet and still, next slide, 11% wrote in their own genders. Now, this is like one of my favorite things in the study, honestly, because we'll see that there are so many things we're up against in constructing our lives and making partnerships and securing our economic and social and health well-being. But here you can see kind of resistance, creativity, and joy in the ways that we're thinking about ourselves, describing ourselves, constructing ourselves. A couple of my favorites on here, just a regular lady who expresses a variety. And then, of course, autistic, genderqueer, folksy, solar punk, whiskey, grandpa, homebody. I mean, I really want to meet that person and that person's gender. So again, I think people think a certain way about LGBT women and our genders, and I think this study is going to bust a lot of mythologies. Next one. Respondents who report complex or fluid and changing genders and sexualities are living on lower incomes than those who did not check sexuality as complex or fluid and changing. I think this is one of the most important findings in the study, and it's a secret. And I'm giving it to you, 2-3 weeks ahead of time. This is really important data that those of us whose genders and sexualities are not so fixed, and we're morphing and constructing our paths as we go and making different meanings, the workplace, the wage to labor market is not as happy to see us as people who experience that as more fixed over the lifespan. That makes total sense to me. It works for me around anecdotally what I see, but this is the first major study that I think we found this, and I think it's really huge. Next. Education, again, this is not a random sample. We have more than twice the level of higher education than a random sample would have. So again, it's very interesting to look at income and assets, as we will, across these 3 books, to see that, higher education usually means you're exposed to less violence, you have a house, you have a certain kind of economic security that our respondents do not have. So again, more on that later, but we have 2.5 level, 2.5 times the level of, graduate degrees of the general population. Next. Class of origin, I haven't done a lot of this with this yet, but I'm really happy to see we have, a majority of people are, who grew up middle class, but we also have a good size sample of people who grew up working class and poor. Next. Personal income. Our personal income levels they don't exactly adhere to Gen Pop, but they're similar. We are lower in the very high categories, especially for people in our income categories, in our education categories. Next. Age groups. This is a really interesting age sample where we skew a tiny bit older than the general population, but I think this is going to be one of the biggest samples of 60 plus that's out there. So you can see it's significant. We're low on the 18 to 29-year-olds, but I would say otherwise we've done a pretty good job of representation across. A lot to work with here. And even that 18 to 19-year-old sample, we have some really interesting things around sexuality in that sample that we're able to look at. Next. Sexuality within age groups. Here's just like a typical kind of comparison we're able to make, is to look at how are people identifying and how is it different across age. So of course, lesbian for this, highly femme lesbian identified. For the 60 and over, that's, a huge identification, but you can see in the younger folks, there's much more, many, many more people who identify different ways. So next one. Race and ethnicity. This is a pretty good community sample. We have 27% people who are BIPOC identified in any way, and 72 or 73% who are white only. And again, that doesn't meet Gen Pop standards, but for a community sample, it's much better than average. So happy about that. Always better to get better representation. We worked really hard on it. And, I would say we didn't get to where I wanted to, but this is great data. Next. Region, we did a great job with region. As you can see, they're pretty well distributed. So we'll be able to make comparisons, and especially now that we're looking at how different state policies are affecting people. We did a zip code ask, so people are going to be able to get reports based on their, granularly based on their areas. Next. These are the conceptual areas that we looked at. So, I talked a little bit about that when we were talking about the table of contents for the 3 books, but you can see we've covered again, we did this by committee. We had all these LGBTQ women, about 22 people on the advisory committee and 5 people on the core team. And it felt like all of us were just so dedicated to questions in the areas we were working on, the areas of our activism and our research. Everybody got their questions in, for better or for worse. Next. Yeah, meta findings. Okay, shh, don't tell anybody. But here's a big one. Every time we look at people who are engaging with institutions to help us, whether it's K through 12 education, higher education, whether we are facing violence and we're going to a domestic violence shelter or the police or, a community program, whether we are trying to access our health care or, dealing with disabilities. Institutions fail us and our friends save us. That's going to be one of my favorite things I say over and over again for the next several years talking about this data. We found low engagement with institutions across the board, even in crisis for our people, and extremely high reliance on our friendship networks. And by that, I mean mostly our LGBT friendship networks. People are also looking toward, mostly their chosen family and also some folks' family of origin. Next. Here's another thing that we asked, which I just don't think people are asking us, which is, what do we think is driving the abuse that we're describing? And we let people say, and a much higher percentage of people said sexism because I'm a woman than any other reason. Racism came in second, anti-LGBT animus third, and then the fourth one, which I think is hugely important, is that I'm being targeted for my weight or fat phobia. In our health section, people report being diagnosed as overweight and obese because we think of that as a social construction, frankly. And people are really reporting on, embodiment, their queer embodiment as being a huge driver of sexism across gender and sexuality identities. Next. This one's interesting. BIPOC women, Black, Indigenous, people of color in the sample report fluid and changing sexualities and genders more often than white respondents. So along with, as we looked at that list ahead, sexism, racism, anti-LGBT animus, their genders and sexualities, the fluidity of that is also adding a layer of vulnerability to discrimination and abuse for our BIPOC respondents. I think that's super interesting data and not really thought of. I mean, there's sort of a lot of conservative rhetoric, racist conservative rhetoric that comes out that characterize LGBT women of color a certain way. And I think this is really important data. Next. Vulnerabilities. This is huge, and again, top secret, but, our experiences of disability, 50% of people in the study said they were experiencing some kind of disability, with mental health conditions being the highest, but also lots of other things, physical, neurodiversity, mobility conditions. So 50%. So if you're an LGBT woman partnering with an LGBT woman, you're 50% likely to have it yourself, and then you're also possibly dealing with it in your partner. And then rates of IPV, intimate partner violence, 47%. We asked a lot of questions about the identities of perpetrators for IPV, and I think we have data, frankly, that nobody else has. The gender and sexuality identities of your perpetrators, and we have really interesting things to say about how we're being abused and what the vulnerabilities are based on the identities of our partners. So stay tuned for that. I think it's some of the most interesting stuff in the study. I keep saying that. It's the most interesting thing. There's so many interesting things for me. Next. And again, this is the institutions fail us slide, which I think is really important. 54% of people who went to the police said they didn't help at all. And in surviving IPV, our friends, our chosen family, our family of origin, crucial. Next. Places of joy and resilience. We have a whole chapter on our sexual practices, the ways we're being intimate, what we love, and also what the biggest sources of joy in our lives are. And I just love this one slide, which is we ask people how often, and again, one of the great things about the study is I feel like we ask questions that we ask each other that nobody really cares about us, or nobody even thinks about us, which is, how often are you having sex as your authentic self in terms of your gender and your sexuality? And 73% of our respondents said they're often or sometimes having consensual sex in their authentic genders or their authentic sexualities. So that's just huge. It's such good news. I'm so sick of, I don't know about you, but I'm so sick of sort of the lesbian bed death, women having sex with women is just not very interesting. What's going on there? Nothing's going on there. Also, another thing that is top secret is I think we're having more sex than our cisgender hetero counterparts. I mean, I used a bunch of different answers to a bunch of questions and a few federal surveys and kind of tried to play them off of each other. But I make a good argument that we're actually having more sex than the general population, and which, you know, does get recorded in various kinds of general social surveys. So anyway, you know, so the bad news is 25% of us are not having sex in our authentic genders and sexualities. So that's like some serious work for us. But what we found in the study was that people had a lot to say about their joy, and so much of it was about having the freedom to have their queer embodiments, their LGBT lives, their communities. So I love this one. And next. And then finally, policy priorities. We asked everyone, if we were in charge of various movements' policy priorities, what would they be? And universal healthcare came out so far ahead of everything else. And, you know, when I came into the LGBT movement in 1990 in Matter of Shivad, that was the movement's #1 priority. And I feel like, you know, there was such solidarity between gay men and lesbians and other queers at the time around the AIDS crisis. Everybody really understood the importance of universal healthcare. And now, you know, for me, the queer belonging thing has robbed us of our focus, or, you know, the emphasis on relationships and, you know, being a part of society. You know, I wish all those gay dollars had gone into universal healthcare instead. It certainly would have served the people in the study better, certainly would have served my family better. So reproductive rights and access to care, #2. Those are really the top 2 by far. And then gun control, LGBTQ rights, and ending racism, which, you know, I love all of those. I love that for us, you know. And we also did not provide a list because we did not want to, I don't know, prompt or, you know, prejudice anybody about a particular priority. So this is all from write-in data. And that's it, right? So that's the last slide. That's a lot.
That's the last slide. Yep.
So,
and stop the share. We'll just go on full screen. Jamie, that was a lot and amazing, and we're really honored that you shared with the staff of the Smithsonian first. So let's go to questions. Let's see, we have 2 in the chat. Yep. Oh, we saw those, and the secret is that this hasn't been published yet. So folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or raise your emoji hand, and Jamie here will answer them.
Yeah, so June 25th, I'm going to have a conversation with Amani Rupert Gordon, who's the head of NCLR, Tara Russell Slavin, who's the Chief Impact Officer at the LGBT Community Center in LA, and Amani Woody, who you may or may not know, big DC activist who's done all this work on LGBT people and aging, and has founded Mary's House here. I see Mary's House people here. We're going to talk together about the findings and what we think they mean to LGBTQ women and to the movement. So Mary, I just want to talk about this data forever. I really do. I think there's just so much rich, you know, our respondents gave us everything. We asked so many intimate and personal questions, and people worked really hard to tell their stories, and we really want to report out well.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. The question is, so much fantastic information presented here. Why are some of the things secret? What is the concern with sharing the findings? Just, you want to share one more time that you are releasing later this month?
Yes, because the book isn't out yet. So wait till June 25th. And then let's go. I mean, then I want you to, you know, talk about it all over the place.
Right.
But it's really kind of embargoed data. I'm not supposed to be talking about it yet. When Adam asked me, he asked me like a year ago, and I was like, oh, the book's going to be out on June 1st, as we know how that goes, right?
Yeah.
So the book is going to be out on June 25th. So
great. And Jamie will share it with us, and we'll make sure to get it out to the Smithsonian Pride and other groups. My friend Catherine Ott says, to what extent do you think the origin of the survey influenced who found it and answered, for example, your reputations, etc.?
Oh, I think so. And you know, we worked really hard on the advisory committee. If you look at it, it's sort of a 22-person dream team, right? So, I mean, Amani's on there. Andrea Jenkins is on there, who runs the Minneapolis City Council. We picked people who, you know, LGBTQ women would look at and say, I trust this person. I trust their work. They've been in the community forever. Marianne Adams, who founded Zami Nobla and has done all these Black lesbian chapters all over the South for years. I mean, is just like such a giant in the community, is on the, it's a snowball sample, right? So it always snowballs out from the architecture of the project, of the people who did it. And we also had 150 community organizations, everything from, the LGBT Center in New York and LA, and I would say Centerlink did a really great job, and the big organizations. But we also had really tiny organizations, tiny queer, trans, intersex organizations who came on board early and just really talked to their people about it. So any community sample is as good as its architecture, if you ask me, and so we tried to be really thoughtful about our architecture, but we also, this is a COVID sample. We were in the field during a time where we could do almost nothing in person, and we had planned to do so much in-person work with this group. So, we're sad about that, and it means the sample has limitations, that we wished it did not. But it's also kind of historic in that it is a COVID sample. I mean, I haven't even really thought of all the implications of that yet. We are asking people, what's happened to you in the last year? What's happened? I mean, there's all kinds of time stamps in the thing where we ask, is this over the lifespan? But we have a lot of questions about how you've been doing in the last year. And so I think, pluses and minuses.
So while folks think about their questions and put them in the chat, raise their hands, let me ask you one of those questions that comes up in every talk. What is the role for museums here? What is museums can do, the Smithsonian can do to help partner, amplify, and make use of this data?
That's a great question. I mean, I think looking at ways what's in the data points out to you what's not in the museum. You know what I mean? Or what you're not dealing with, or what's the full picture here, and thinking about how to illuminate that. Like it is like the Jane Addams experience I had from Parallel Politics. It's like, here's all these great things about her life, and like she's completely invisible to everybody who comes through here as a lesbian, right? So when you think about that, then we are showing queer people in various settings, right? But we're not showing the fullness of us. This study really shows a kind of fullness that very little research really achieves at this point. I mean, if you look at federal and state, instruments that look at LGBT life, they're very blunt instruments. And that was the thing we really wanted to do differently with a community survey, was to create so many different categories and so many ways of looking at us, that it's kind of leaving breadcrumbs for researchers and places like the Smithsonian to pick up and do new work with.
Great. We have a question from Kara. Did you say what the age breakdown of the respondents was? Wondering how much respondents' age aligned with more or less gender fluidity. Great question. Thank you.
So the question is, I mean, the younger people are more gender fluid, but there's gender fluidity across the whole sample, which is interesting. That's the other thing. I sort of feel like it belies this idea that LGBT women, that this is a new idea in the community. And the sample's about 5 or 6 years older than the general population as a whole, if you were doing a Gen Pop study, right? So, which isn't bad.
Great. Let's talk beyond sex. Did you ask about why those who aren't having sex, why they aren't active?
We did ask people what their biggest barriers to sex were, and low libido is number one. And I'm actually a sex coach and do a lot of work on sex and sexuality, and low libido is number one for everyone across the board. So that was kind of interesting. I can't remember the other ones now. But I remember it is pretty interesting. I mean, the weight fat phobia shit really comes up in this too, that people are dealing with internalized, and also partners telling them. And it was really interesting. That came up higher than trauma from abuse. So I do think we really are going to talk about this. And again, sort of until I have all 3 books together, there's so much data to look at across different things, and how different things are playing out. But that was surprising to me.
Yeah, it was striking to me as well that the health and kind of the targeted for those who are reported for weight. That was just really shocking data. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I know that we're all very interested in the health of our audiences and the public, but also the correlation to COVID must have been really startling, and the impact on those individuals and their mental health throughout the pandemic, and which you probably captured as well.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I'm just starting to work on the health chapters now, so I don't have really, there's so much health data in here, both like outcomes, access to a provider who, is LGBT friendly or is women friendly or is trans friendly, whether people have coverage. So, I don't really have a lot to say about that yet. I'm really in preliminary with looking at that data. But I will say, even just glancing across the thing, I do think that targeted for our weight, I mean, it's just really interesting. I mean, for me, I've been lesbian identified since the, early 80s. And I would say as a young queer, this sort of not having to deal with cis ideas about what a beautiful body is, and that the community accommodated all kinds of different bodies and was interested in them, was kind of a place of LGBTQ liberation. But then how medical systems perceive us, right? And greet us, and then the kind of violence we have to face, and then we have to get into the workplace. And the workplace also would rather have skinny cisgender women, right? So, I'm just surprised to see it so legible in the study across many different questions.
Jay asked, will there be an annual take on this data, comparing the information from year to year over time?
Well, here's the thing. We had to kill ourselves to raise the money for this. And the only reason we raised it was because we had, someone in the movement who'd been a giant in philanthropy. And Urvashi and I fundraised for a whole year, and everyone told us no. Let me just say, nobody gave a shit about LGBTQ women. We couldn't get a national organization to take it on. Nobody. And it just pissed us off. Let me just say, don't piss Urvashi Vat off. Or me. And it was just like, well, when I did the trans study, this is exactly what everybody said to me then. We did that on no money. But we did do it embedded in 2 organizations that had staff. We didn't even have that on this. While we were working on this, we had no one on it full time. We had people who were living all the things of the study, like intense disabilities. Urvashi had metastatic cancer. The story of how we got this over the finish line is a freaking story of the study itself. And so we have no money. I mean, I'm basically not funded after September. Like September to December, I need to write that 3rd book. And my hope is that when the first one comes out, somebody is going to give a shit. But that is the state of anybody caring about LGBTQ women. And so, if the Smithsonian wants to give me a fellowship, let me write that last group of books, because, policing and incarceration, shit, we have a lot to say into this moment about that. And we have great data. So, yeah. Somebody asked Catherine asked how much did Irv see? We were still collecting data when she died. I mean, we finished collecting a month after she died. So she saw us through 9/10 of the data collection period. And honestly, we've just been, the whole project, those of us left in it, but we've been wading through our grief, trying to finish. So again, it feels like many of the questions in the study around why it's hard for LGBT women to sustain ourselves and our families were living on in the lives of the people trying to do this study as we went.
Thank you for that. And Catherine, thank you for that question on Irv. We have a question here from Floyd. Could some of these issues be covered by the SEP survey, which is centrally funded every year? That's the Smithsonian Employee Perspective Survey. Interesting. That would give not just institution-wide data, but unit-specific data that might be useful for idea entities within the various units. Oh, interesting. So could the Smithsonian staff survey help to partner on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in. You know what I'm saying? I mean, anything that we can do to continue this work, I'm in. I mean, I think what happens for me in coming up against institutions is institutions have their own agendas and their own, and sort of giving you the freedom to actually do this kind of work is rare. But I'm very in. So if somebody wants to get a hold of me to talk about, you know, how to continue funding this, I'm open.
Right, and hopefully the news of when it comes out, when book one comes out, will be great. And we have some love coming in the chat. A beautiful comment from Say. Thank you for writing that. I certainly echo her comment. Other questions for our great speaker and looking at this data. Also, I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the sample portion that 50% of the respondents registered as disabled, with some interesting findings on neurodiversity and some other things. What does that say about the community, and what is the hope there that comes out of this?
Well, the other things in the disability chapter is that almost nobody's getting workplace accommodation. I mean, we're getting workplace accommodation at so much less a level. We're not even asking for it. We asked people if they'd ask for it, and of those people who were disabled, like 53% said they'd never even tried. So I thought, wow, this is really something to think about around our own advocacy organizations, right? I mean, why aren't we even trying? And, you know, so 15% of people who are eligible or who could be eligible are getting workplace accommodations when, you know, some studies have said about 55% of the workforce that might be eligible is getting them. So I think that's just a huge place to think about how we're supporting LGBTQ women in the workforce. And yeah, I mean, we are, and you know, neurodiversity was a really big thing as well. I mean, I think that's just become more visible in the community in the last 10 years or so. And I think a lot of workplaces are trying to figure that out. Yeah, we are. And again, it was very interesting to be working on the study with so many of the people in the study who were all in the gig economy, basically, most of us dealing with, you know, multiple disabilities while we were trying to finish it. I mean, I laugh, but honestly, I'm laughing so I don't cry. I mean, there was just a lot of, you know, there were a lot of barriers, and here we are. I mean, I'm so freaking psyched to be coming out with the book. It's so important.
I know that we have coming up soon the folks from the National Trans Study, and I know that from talking with them that so much of this work is about helping policy. Is that one of the goals here, that this moves into policy world?
I mean, there's just a million policy implications. At the end of every chapter, I have a section called community notes. And the other thing that I really like about community data is I'm interested in policy and specific policies that we can move, you know, and really focus on to make our lives better. But I see that happening as we movement build, which means we sort of have to change frames on what we think is important, what we think an LGBT women's issue is, who we think LGBTQ women are, and what's meaningful in our lives. That's what I really think this book is going to drive. And then that drives policy, right? Rather than sort of asking a dry question about something, you know? I think the ways that we've posed these questions are giving us a lot of nuance about what matters in the lives of LGBTQ women. And then we can start to really dream about what are real policies. I mean, you know, I think given what we see what we can see happening when LGBT women try to access stuff from institutions, we have to rethink all these institutions, not just sort of try to elbow our way into access to a lot of them, which I think is a good short-term plan. But clearly our policing numbers, you know, I mean, I got started in IPV work in the 80s. You know, we were spending all this time training police, and that work has really brought us nowhere. in terms of serving our community. So if our friends are what's really supporting us, why aren't we putting money into our sociality and our friendship networks and working on what it means to have long-term friendships and deal with estrangements and just supporting our friends in whatever ways that is, right? Like, I think LGBT women's friendship networks are the most, they pay off the best, and they are the least, they're the least appreciated thing in the movement. And I would say that, across queer identities as well. So, what do we think about that in terms of, I think there's so much great work coming out of transformative justice movements right now that are mostly queer women of color led, that are about getting our own houses in order around how we relate to each other and dealing with those IPV numbers and dealing with estrangement in the community, because at the end of the day, we are our first, last, and best support.
Great. Jay writes, did the division between queer women and early feminist waves come up? Are modern feminists more likely to be inclusive of queer people?
Yeah, what was so great was we had so few TERFs in this study. We had so much, again, and I sort of feel like, what happens for me in looking at these things is, the divisions just get amplified in straight culture, like for a reason. But actually, when you look at even like, I helped found lesbian services here. I think Catherine Ott did too. Lesbians really founded trans services at Whitman Walker, 20 years ago, because we were partnering with trans people, so, and it's like, but the word on lesbians is, anti-trans, anti-trans, anti-trans. That's for a reason, and it's not from inside of us, right? So I think I love that when I look at the study across all these ages, so many of the write-ins and also our gender and sexuality diversity. The people who were not trans identified in the study had almost as much diversity of gender expression and sexuality expression as the people who did identify as trans in the study. So for me, that really rings anecdotally around my life and how we've all lived, as queers in the last 40 years. So I love being able to bring those things to light, because again, the traditional research just doesn't even think about us this way, doesn't even think to ask us, or very, very little of it does. So viva la, nuances that are here. I'm very excited about them.
Yeah. Jimmy, you just spoke about the LGBTQ friendship networks and the community and the folks creating their own families, their own networks. What is the role of space and place there? The idea of those third places or spaces where people come together from communities.
So important.
What did you all learn about that?
Well, I think the spaces our community centers and our community projects and our community health things are making, they're so important. And then we have to think to ourselves, how good a job are we doing? And we did ask in a lot of different places, how welcome do you feel in LGBTQ space, right? And there are definitely disparities for people. One of the things that the people with disabilities in the study said their biggest barrier to access was being othered in the spaces they were in, including LGBTQ spaces. So it sort of speaks to not just setting up the chairs in a certain way, but having disabled people in the architecture of your social projects so that you're not just tacking them on and trying to bring them in, and then they do feel like this isn't me, this isn't my community, my people aren't here, this whole program has nothing to do with me, right? So, there was that. And then there was also, when we asked people across race what they thought about race and racism in LGBTQ women's spaces, white women thought that it existed for sure. And they also thought that sexism lands on women of color differently. But there was still a pretty big disparity between how welcoming they thought LGBTQ spaces were overall. White women perceived them as much more welcoming than the BIPOC women in the study did. And there's just some very interesting data there. That's in book 2. I can't wait to get to that. Yeah.
In addition to, including the disabled and folks in the architecture, like how you said that, do you have other recommendations while it's in book 2? Do you have other kind of recommendations and findings that you can share about what it means to improve and create spaces that are better welcoming and more tolerant?
Yeah, I mean, they're all in the June 25th report. In the community notes moving forward, there's just a lot of different things to chew on there. I do have data on family makeup, Catherine. It's coming out in the September report. The family stuff is so freaking interesting. We asked so many questions like, how did you create your family? How did your kids come to you? What are the genders, races of your kids and your parents? What are the sexualities of your kids? Oh, I have such unbelievably explosive data. I just don't even know how I'm going to talk about it. But I decided not to do it in this first run because I actually really need some time with it. I've been working on the family data for a long time. And I have a very, I have one of those families that also doesn't fit the mold of how LGBT people have families and get their kids. And so, of course, it was super interesting to me. But what I found was like, oh, my God, how am I even going to talk about this? We are doing such amazing things in the ways that we're making our families and taking care of our families. And our kids are amazing. And our kids have challenges. I mean, that's the other thing is that I feel like we've worked so hard to get everybody to agree that it's okay for us to parent, that we've also really downplayed the challenges that our kids are facing. And I want to stop that. So
3 things here. Catherine, feel free to ask those questions. We would all love to hear your thoughts and questions. I know I would. And then our colleague Ava says, any book or article recommendations for people interested in this topic? And I guess also recommendations, where should folks go to, where should we as Smithsonian staff go to find places to talk about the challenges where these families are experiencing for help, guidance?
So you're asking, where does Smithsonian people go to sort of learn more and get into this kind of advocacy?
And to learn about it. So you've talked about the joy, but there's also challenges. So are there places that you're currently recommending or recommendations and slash any book or article recommendations for people interested in this topic?
I mean, I really, really lean heavily toward transformative justice work right now. So I would say queer feminist work like Mia Mingus's blog, Leaving Evidence. She's doing so much great work on disability. I think Miriam Kaba's work on repair right now is so critical.
We lost Jamie. Let's see if she can come back. One on everybody. Jamie had a call in earlier from her phone, so let's see if she's able to come back into us. For those online, if you have any recommendations for books or articles on these subjects, in addition to what Jamie was sharing, please do put them in the chat. I'm sure we'd all like to see that.
I'm back.
Thank you. Great.
So Miriam Kaba's Fumbling Toward Repair, I think a really important book that was done years ago called The Revolution Starts at Home, which is an anthology about violence in LGBTQ activist spaces. And a lot of the thinking there is really the thinking I think we should be moving toward, which is thinking about our friendships, thinking about how we're building capacity inside our communities for health, wellness, connection, and then building out from there, and then with that kind of wellness, trying to create the kind of institutions that really are going to serve us. What else do I talk about? Those books for me right now are kind of my guiding lights. Adrienne Marie Brown's work, emergent strategies, pleasure activism, all of that. Super.
while the study did get a lot of different, really fascinating with the data on some of the older groups, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about some of the younger audience that you picked up on here. Certainly, there was a nice percentage of millennials, but also you saw some folks younger. What have we learned about the younger side of your respondents?
Yeah, super interesting. The sex and sexuality pieces. I'm not really ready to talk about this stuff yet, but
We're here, we're listening.
general social survey has been saying that general population's been having less and less sex over the last 10 years or so. They check it out every 2 years, and for young people, the YRBS is less and less and less. And everybody's sort of portending doom about this, that this indicates that we're disconnected, da 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 da. But I actually think that all the work that queer feminist women have been doing on consent and what is a good relationship and what is a potentially red flag relationship, I think it's landing. I think, especially with young people who are having sex later, it's not just that they've been isolated because of COVID, it's that they really don't want to deal with bullshit. And they can see what bullshit is. And so I'm interested in looking at our 18 to 19-year-olds, especially, because they're not having as much sex as our older cohorts are. And again, it's like, this is very interesting data to me. And I think there's many other questions in the survey for a researcher that's interested in making conjecture or trying to look at how these things add up, right? So I'm not running multiple regression analysis in this study because we just have too much data and no money. I am reporting on frequencies. But for someone who wants to look at the young people in the sample, and then their experiences of violence, their experiences in school, their experiences in their family of origin, what they say their favorite things are about sex, what their favorite sexual practices, it's all there. Someone who wants to look at that, they have 15 different domains to look at to think about risks, vulnerability, and resiliences, right? Resiliencies. There's like a million PhDs in this data waiting to happen. I'm happy to talk to people who have interests in particular age cohorts.
Mm-hmm.
People in their 20s and 30s are having the most sex. And then we've got the 60 plus. We have a very big sample of 60 plus. In terms of LGBT women and aging, I think we've got like the biggest, most interesting sample out there.
Yes.
So your AARP people, I mean, they can look at all these different domains, 170 questions. What's happening for these folks? How do they think about themselves? What are their challenges?
Yeah. And Jamie, I wonder with that, if you can give us a closing and remind everybody when the study comes out, how they can find out more about this, the study, and your final words.
Yes. So the, www.LGBTQ Women's Survey is the website where everything lives. We're opening our data portal on Monday, the 12th. And then the first report is coming out June 25th. So on Monday, the 12th, I'll be in conversation with our team at Emory about that this data is going to be available to everybody in the community to do what they want to do with it. That was a crucial commitment from Urvashi. And this data is going back to all the people who gave us their stories so that scholars and activists can use it.
And with that, I'd like to thank you for participating in the Smithsonian Staff Learning Series. This is certainly really fascinating, interesting, and helpful to the work that we're doing. And we really appreciate that you came to us early and before the everyone else found out about it. So, and also to those who joined, thank you very much. This recording will be added later to the deck and will come on Prism soon. So thanks everyone and have a great day. And we'll see you all next week for our next talk.
Bye.